My high school bully tormented me relentlessly for years. But a dark family secret, a shocking confession, and a twist of fate finally brought him and his whole world crashing down. It was my sophomore year of high school when the real torment began. High school is supposed to be the time when you figure out who you are, but for me, it felt more like a daily struggle to survive. I wasn't the strongest or the most outgoing, and I guess that painted a target on my back for guys like Brad and his crew. They were the popular kids, the kind who seemed to have everything handed to them. Captain of the football team, homecoming king, all that cliche stuff. And I was just me. Every day was like a scene out of one of those teen dramas, but without the happy ending. They called me Mouse, partly because of my small frame, and partly because I was always quiet. And Brad? He was the ringleader of it all. It started with small things, flicking my books off my desk, accidentally tripping me in the hallway. But as the weeks went on, the pranks turned crueler. One day, I found my locker filled with shredded paper and ketchup packets. Another time, they swapped my gym clothes with a skirt and laughed until their faces turned red when I walked out of the locker room wearing it, not realizing until it was too late. I tried reporting them to the teachers, but Brad's charm always seemed to win them over. He's just joking, they'd say. Don't take it personally. But it wasn't just me who suffered. Brad had a way of pulling everyone into his games. Even people who were nice to me when he wasn't around joined in when he was. The only person who never turned on me was my best friend, David. If it weren't for him, I might have lost it completely. He was my anchor, the one who always reminded me that high school didn't last forever, that someday life would look different. What I didn't know then was just how right he would be. One day, something happened that would stick with me forever. It was a rainy afternoon, and I was heading home after detention. I'd been late to class too many times because I was avoiding Brad and his cronies. As I walked down the empty hallway, I heard their voices echo behind me. They cornered me outside the school doors, their laughter bouncing off the brick walls as they started pushing me around. Brad grabbed my backpack and dumped its contents into a puddle, smirking as the rain soaked my notebooks. "Why do you even bother showing up, Mouse?" he sneered. "Nobody wants you here." I don't know what came over me, but for the first time, I snapped back. Maybe nobody wants me here, but at least I'm not a miserable piece of trash like you. His smile froze for a second before morphing into a snarl. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes, something dark like I'd just chipped away at the perfect mask he wore for the world. He stepped closer, raising his fist like he was ready to finish me off right there. But then, the unexpected happened. Part 2. The beginning of the end. As Brad raised his fist, a sharp voice sliced through the air like thunder. "What the hell is going on here?" I turned, and there was Mr. Calloway, our school janitor. He was an older guy, probably in his late 60s, with a grizzled beard and a baseball cap that seemed glued to his head. Most people ignored him, but not me. I always saw how hard he worked to keep the place running. Brad froze, his fist still cocked midair, as if Mr. Calloway's presence had pressed the pause button on his cruel intentions. "Nothing, sir," Brad said, his voice dripping with fake respect. "Just joking around." Calloway's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I could see that he wasn't buying it. But instead of lecturing Brad, he turned to me. "You all right, kid?" I nodded, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. Brad and his gang slithered off, laughing and punching each other on the shoulders as if nothing had happened. But before Brad disappeared around the corner, he turned back and shot me a look, a promise that this wasn't over. After they left, Mr. Calloway crouched down and started gathering my drenched notebooks from the puddle. "Kids these days," he muttered, "think they can get away with murder just because their parents have money." I thanked him quietly and tried to take the papers from his hands, but he waved me off. "You know," he said, looking up at me with those piercing, wise eyes, "life has a funny way of evening the score." "What do you mean?" I asked, hugging my backpack tightly. "You'll see," he said cryptically, handing me my now soggy geometry homework. Guys like Brad don't always land on their feet, no matter how high they fly in high school. I didn't believe him at the time. Brad seemed untouchable, like the world bent over backward to give him what he wanted. But Calloway's words stuck with me. Life went on, as it does, but something about that moment felt like the shifting of gears. like the universe had taken note of Brad's cruelty and was getting ready to act. The next week, a rumor started spreading. Brad had been benched from the football team for skipping practice too many times. It wasn't a huge deal. He was still the golden boy, but it was enough to chip away at his seemingly perfect image. I noticed him snapping at his friends more, his patience wearing thinner every day. Then, a few weeks later, something bigger happened. Brad's dad, who was a big shot in town, lost his job. Apparently, there was some kind of scandal involving embezzlement. People whispered about it in hushed tones, but no one dared to bring it up around Brad. Except me. It wasn't planned. I didn't mean to say anything. But one day in class, when Brad made some snide comment about my clothes, the words just spilled out. At least my dad isn't a criminal. The entire room went silent. Brad's face turned red, and for the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. "You better watch your mouth, Mouse," he growled, but his voice cracked just enough to let me know I'd hit a nerve. After that, things started spiraling for Brad. His parents' divorce made the local news, and his once loyal crew began to distance themselves. His perfect image was crumbling, and the cracks were impossible to ignore. But the most unexpected twist was yet to come. Part 3. The Fall. A month after Brad's dad's scandal broke, something happened that no one in our small town saw coming. Brad quit the football team. It wasn't just the benching or the family drama. Something deeper was eating away at him. He went from being the guy who strutted down the hall like he owned the place to someone who barely made eye contact with anyone. The rumors flew fast and wild. His dad had gambled away their money. They were selling their house. His mom had moved to another state. I didn't know what was true, and honestly, I didn't care. For the first time in years, Brad wasn't towering over me, and that felt like a small victory. But the thing about guys like Brad is they don't go down without a fight. One Friday after school, David and I were walking home when we heard a car pull up behind us. It was Brad, leaning out of the window of his beat-up Jeep, his face pale and drawn but his smirk still intact. "Hey, Mouse," he yelled. "Heard your little art project got second place at the school fair. Too bad second place doesn't count for shit." David rolled his eyes. "Ignore him," he muttered, pulling me along. But Brad wasn't done. He slammed the car in a park and jumped out, blocking our path. His usual crew wasn't with him this time, and something about his energy felt off, like he was desperate, clinging to the last scraps of the control he used to have. "What do you want, Brad?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thought I'd remind you who you're dealing with. Don't think for a second that just because my dad screwed up, I'm going to let you walk all over me." David stepped in front of me, his jaw tight. "Back off, Brad." Brad's eyes darted between us, and for a second, I thought he might actually throw a punch. But then, as if on cue, a police cruiser rounded the corner and slowed to a stop. "Problem here, boys?" Officer Daniels asked, leaning out of the driver's side window. Daniels had been patrolling our neighborhood for years, and he had a soft spot for me, probably because he'd broken up more than one of Brad's jokes at my expense. Brad's face hardened. "No problem," he said, stepping back toward his Jeep. But before he climbed in, he glared at me one last time. "This isn't over, Mouse." I thought it was an empty threat. I thought Brad was just grasping at straws, trying to prove he still had power. But that weekend, I realized just how far he was willing to go. Sunday morning, I woke up to a loud banging on our front door. I stumbled out of bed, groggy and confused, to find my mom arguing with someone on the porch. It was Brad's mom. "I don't know what your son said to mine," she hissed, her voice trembling, "but Brad came home last night completely wrecked. He said you humiliated him. Do you know what he's been through? Do you have any idea what our family's going through?" My mom, ever the peacemaker, tried to calm her down. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Brad's mom snapped. "Your son's been running his mouth, and now my boy is in his room refusing to come out. He's not eating. He's not sleeping. Do you want that on your conscience?" I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to every word. Part of me wanted to feel guilty, but another part of me, the part that had endured years of torment, felt a strange, defiant satisfaction. Brad had finally tasted what it felt like to be powerless. But that satisfaction didn't last long. Part 4. The Reckoning. The next day at school, Brad didn't show up. His absence wasn't unusual. He'd been skipping more and more lately, but the whispers in the hallways were louder than ever. I heard his parents are filing for bankruptcy. Nah, I heard he got caught shoplifting at the mall. Someone said he tried to fight his coach and got expelled. David and I exchanged a glance as we walked to class. You think any of that's true? He asked. I shrugged. Honestly, at this point, nothing would surprise me. But then something did surprise me. After lunch, I was called to the principal's office. My stomach dropped. I hadn't done anything wrong. At least, not that I could think of, but being summoned to see Principal Hayes was never a good sign. When I walked in, I saw Brad sitting in one of the chairs, his head hung low, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of the chair. His mom was sitting next to him, her face a mask of cold fury. Take a seat, Principal Hayes said, gesturing to the chair across from them. I sat down, my heart pounding. Do you have any idea why you're here? Hayes asked, his tone neutral. No, sir, I replied, though the tension in the room told me it had something to do with Brad. Brad's mom didn't waste any time. Your son has been harassing mine, she said, her voice clipped. He's been spreading lies, humiliating Brad in front of his peers, and it's affecting his mental health. My jaw dropped. What? That's not true. Brad finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. Don't act all innocent, Mouse, he muttered. You've been running your mouth ever since my dad lost his job. You think you're better than me now. I wanted to scream. The irony of Brad, the guy who'd tormented me for years, accusing me of harassment, was almost laughable. Brad's been bullying me since middle school, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You can ask anyone in this school. Principal Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That's exactly why we're here. I've been made aware of some ongoing issues between the two of you. And while I don't condone Brad's past behavior, it seems this situation has escalated to a point where it's affecting both of you. Escalated? I asked, incredulous. I haven't done anything to him. Brad's mom leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. You called his father a criminal in front of the entire class. I froze. That had been weeks ago, and I hadn't thought much of it since. But clearly it had stuck with Brad and his mom. That's not harassment, I said defensively. It was one comment. After years of him tormenting me, I think I'm allowed one comeback. Principal Hayes sighed, rubbing his temples. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about finding a way forward. Brad, I need you to understand that your actions over the years have contributed to this situation. And you, he said, turning to me, need to be mindful of how your words can impact others, even if you feel justified. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was supposed to be my chance to finally hold Brad accountable, but instead, it felt like we were being lumped into the same category. After the meeting, I walked out of the office feeling more frustrated than ever. Brad's mom gave me one last glare before dragging her son away, and I couldn't help but notice the slight smirk he threw over his shoulder. That night, I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my head, feeling the anger build. Brad might have been down, but he wasn't out, and he wasn't done with me yet. Part 5, A Whisper from the Past. The next morning, everything felt off. It wasn't just the lingering frustration from the meeting with Principal Hayes. There was a weird tension in the air, as though something big was about to happen. When I got to school, the hallways were unusually quiet. People were huddled in small groups, whispering with wide eyes, their faces flickering between shock and pity. What's going on? I asked David when I found him by our lockers. He looked uneasy, like he wasn't sure how to tell me. You haven't heard? Heard what? David hesitated before leaning in closer. It's Brad. He got arrested last night. I froze. Arrested? For what? David glanced around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. Apparently, he broke into someone's house. They caught him trying to steal a bunch of stuff. The words hit me like a truck. Brad, untouchable, golden boy Brad, had been caught breaking into someone's house? It didn't make sense. Whose house? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David hesitated again, and that pause told me everything I needed to know. Yours, he finally said. My blood ran cold. He tried to break into my house? I repeated, my mind racing. When? Why? Late last night, David said. Apparently, your neighbor saw him sneaking around and called the cops. They caught him climbing through your basement window. I felt like I was going to be sick. My house, my safe place, had been violated by the very person who'd made my life miserable for years. What the hell was he trying to steal? I asked, my voice trembling. David shrugged. I don't know, but people are saying he wasn't trying to steal anything. They think he was trying to send a message. I didn't know what that meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The rest of the day was a blur. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of people's stares. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, and a few even with suspicion, like I must have done something to push Brad to such extremes. By the time I got home, I was a bundle of nerves. My mom was waiting for me in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. "You okay?" she asked softly, pulling me into a hug. I nodded, though the truth was I didn't know how I felt. "What happens now?" I asked. She sighed. "Well, the police said Brad's parents are trying to keep this quiet, but the charges are serious. Breaking and entering, trespassing. It's not something they can sweep under the rug." I wanted to feel vindicated. After all the pain Brad had caused me, it seemed like karma was finally catching up with him. But instead, I just felt tired. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something I was missing. And the next day, I would find out just how right I was. Part 6. The Secret He Couldn't Keep. The next morning, I walked into school expecting more whispers and stares, but the hallways were eerily quiet. It wasn't just the usual gossip about Brad anymore. Something bigger was brewing. I found David in our usual spot by the lockers, his face pale and tense. "You're not going to believe this," he said, pulling me aside. "What now?" I asked, bracing myself for more bad news. David glanced around before leaning in. "Brad didn't just break into your house. He left something behind." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "I overheard my mom talking about it this morning," he said. "Her friend works at the police station. They found a letter in your basement." "A letter?" I repeated, confusion swirling in my head. "What kind of letter?" David hesitated, then dropped the bombshell. "A confession." I felt the air leave my lungs. "A confession to what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes were wide. "To everything. The bullying, the pranks, and something about his dad. I don't know all the details, but it sounds like Brad was trying to come clean about something big." I didn't know what to say. The idea of Brad, arrogant, invincible Brad, writing a confession felt impossible. But at the same time, it explained why he'd broken into my house. He must have wanted me to find it, but he'd been caught before he could finish what he started. Why would he leave it for me? I asked, more to myself than to David. "Maybe he felt guilty," David suggested. "Or maybe he thought you'd be the only one who'd actually read it." I couldn't focus for the rest of the day. My mind kept replaying David's words, a confession. To everything. What had Brad been hiding? And why had he chosen now to come clean? When I got home that afternoon, my mom was waiting for me again, her face even more serious than before. "We need to talk," she said, gesturing for me to sit down. "What is it?" I asked, already dreading the answer. She took a deep breath. "The police showed me the letter Brad left. They said it was addressed to you." "To me?" She nodded, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "They thought you should be the one to read it." My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. It was a plain white envelope with my name scrawled across the front in Brad's unmistakable handwriting. "Do you want me to stay?" my mom asked gently. I shook my head. "I'll read it on my own." I took the envelope up to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at it for what felt like forever. Finally, I tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was messy, like Brad had been rushing to get it all down. The first line stopped me cold. "I've done terrible things, and I don't deserve forgiveness. But there's something you need to know." The letter went on to detail all the ways Brad had tormented me over the years. He admitted to every prank, every cruel word, every time he'd made me feel small. But then, the letter took a darker turn. The truth is, I was trying to bury my own shame. My dad wasn't just fired for embezzlement. He was caught covering up something worse. He hurt people I knew, and I kept quiet because I was too scared to say anything. I stopped reading, my stomach twisting in knots. What was Brad talking about? As I read further, it became clear Brad's dad had been involved in something far more sinister than financial fraud. There were accusations, real ones, that he'd used his power to exploit others, and Brad had known about it for years. I thought if I acted tough, if I made someone else feel as small as I did, it would make me feel better. But it didn't. It just made me hate myself more. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. The letter was more than a confession. It was a plea for redemption. But the final line hit me like a punch to the gut. I'm sorry for everything. I just hope you can forgive me before it's too late. Part 7. The Breaking Point. That night, I couldn't sleep. Brad's letter was burned into my mind, every word replaying over and over like a broken record. He'd carried so much guilt, so much shame, and the weight of it had clearly broken him. But what scared me the most was that last line. I just hope you can forgive me before it's too late. What did he mean by that? Was he planning to leave town? Hurt himself? I had to find out. The next day, I showed the letter to David. He read it in silence, his expression growing darker with every line. When he was done, he let out a low whistle. "This is heavy," he said, handing it back to me. "Have you talked to anyone about this? Like your mom or the police?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I wanted to figure out what it means first." David frowned. "That last line, you don't think he's going to do something drastic, do you?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't just sit here and wait to find out." We decided to skip lunch and head to the one place we thought Brad might be, the football field. Even though he'd quit the team, he still hung out there sometimes, watching practice from the bleachers like he couldn't let go of the glory days. Sure enough, when we got there, we saw him sitting alone at the top of the bleachers, staring out at the empty field. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "Brad!" I called out, my voice echoing across the field. He didn't respond. David and I climbed up the bleachers, our footsteps clanging against the metal. When we reached him, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many burdens for too long. "What do you want?" he muttered, not even looking at us. I held up the letter. "I got this yesterday. You said you wanted me to forgive you before it's too late. What did you mean by that?" Brad's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? It's already too late." "Too late for what?" I asked, my voice rising in frustration. "Brad, whatever you're going through, you don't have to deal with it alone. But you need to tell me what's going on." He looked at me then, his eyes full of a pain I couldn't even begin to understand. "You think you're the only one I hurt," he said quietly. "You're not. There are other people who deserve better. But I didn't stand up for them. I let it happen, and now they'll never forgive me." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are you talking about?" Brad shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Nothing I say or do can fix it." "It does matter," I insisted. "If there's something you need to make right, you still can. But you have to stop running from it." Brad's expression wavered, and for a moment, I thought I might be getting through to him. But then he stood up and grabbed his backpack. "Just leave me alone, Mouse," he said, starting down the bleachers. "You can't save me. No one can." "Brad!" He turned back, his face hardening. "If I were you, I'd stay out of it. You don't know the kind of people involved in this." And with that, he walked away, leaving me and David sitting there in stunned silence. Part 8. Shadows in the Dark. Brad's warning rattled me. You don't know the kind of people involved in this. His words played on a loop in my head as I tried to piece together the bigger picture. What had Brad's dad done? Who were the people he was so afraid of? And why was Brad convinced that trying to make things right would only make things worse? The next day, I decided to dig deeper. David wasn't thrilled about the idea, but he reluctantly agreed to help. "If we're going to poke around in Brad's mess, we need to be smart about it," he said. We started with the basics, local news archives. It didn't take long to find articles about Brad's dad's embezzlement scandal, but there were gaps, details that felt deliberately vague. A few of the articles mentioned allegations of misconduct, but none elaborated on what that meant. David frowned, scrolling through the screen. "This feels like a cover-up," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. He pointed to the dates on the articles. All of this happened months ago, but the story just disappeared. No follow-ups, no court updates, nothing. It's like someone wanted this swept under the rug. I chewed on my lip, anxiety curling in my stomach. So what now? Do we just stop? David hesitated, then shook his head. No, we keep going. If Brad's dad was involved in something bigger, there's got to be a record of it somewhere. Our next stop was the county courthouse. I'd never been there before, and the sterile, echoing halls made me feel like I was in over my head. We combed through public records, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what Brad had been hinting at. And then we found it. It was buried in a stack of court filings, almost like someone had tried to hide it in plain sight. The document detailed a civil lawsuit against Brad's dad, filed by several former employees of his company. The allegations were horrifying: workplace harassment, exploitation, and even blackmail. My hands shook as I read through the claims. Brad's dad had used his position of power to prey on vulnerable employees, threatening their jobs if they didn't comply with his demands. Some of the allegations hinted at physical abuse, but the language was carefully worded, likely to avoid legal repercussions. "This is it," David said quietly, his face pale. "This is what Brad's been carrying around." We took photos of the documents and left the courthouse, our heads spinning. I couldn't stop thinking about how Brad must have felt, knowing what his father had done and being powerless to stop it. But the more I thought about it, the more something didn't add up. If Brad had known about this for years, why was he only now starting to break under the pressure? What had changed? The answer came later that night, in the form of a frantic text from David. "Brad's in trouble. Meet me at the park. Now." I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I got to the park, David was pacing near the swings, his face a mix of fear and urgency. "What's going on?" I asked, out of breath. He held up his phone, showing me a series of messages he'd received from Brad. "They know I've been talking. I think they're watching me. I don't know what to do. I'm scared." My blood ran cold. "Who's they?" I whispered. David shook his head. "I don't know. But whoever they are, Brad's terrified of them." Before we could figure out our next move, headlights appeared at the edge of the park. A sleek black SUV rolled into the lot, its windows tinted so dark we couldn't see inside. David and I exchanged a nervous glance as the car idled for a moment, then pulled out of the lot and disappeared into the night. "Do you think?" I started, but David cut me off. "We need to find Brad. Now!" Part 9. The night everything changed. David and I raced through the streets, our nerves on edge after seeing the SUV. Brad's cryptic messages made it clear he was in danger, but we had no idea where to start looking. We tried calling him, but every call went straight to voicemail. David suggested we check his house, so we made our way there. By the time we arrived, the sky had gone from deep blue to pitch black, the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the quiet neighborhood. Brad's house looked abandoned. The front porch light was off, and the curtains were drawn. David knocked on the door, but there was no answer. "Maybe he's not here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. David frowned. "Or maybe he doesn't want to be found." We were about to leave when I noticed something. The side gate was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. "Over there," I whispered, pointing. David and I crept around the side of the house, our footsteps muffled by the grass. As we approached the backyard, we heard faint voices, muffled but tense. We crouched behind a row of bushes and peeked through the branches. Brad was there, standing near the edge of the yard. He was talking to two men in suits, their silhouettes illuminated by the glow of a cigarette one of them was holding. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" One of the men growled, his voice low and menacing. Brad's shoulders hunched, but he didn't back down. "I didn't tell them anything. I swear." "You left a damn letter," the second man snapped. "You think that's keeping your mouth shut?" I was just trying to, Brad started, but the first man cut him off. "We don't care what you were trying to do. You've become a liability, and liabilities don't last long." My stomach flipped. These weren't just random thugs. They were professionals, the kind of people who didn't make empty threats. David grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We need to call the cops," he whispered. But before I could respond, the situation escalated. One of the men grabbed Brad by the collar and shoved him against the fence. "You have one chance to make this right," he hissed. "You're going to disappear. No notes, no goodbyes. If we so much as hear your name again, it's over. For you, and for anyone you care about. Brad's face twisted in fear, but he nodded. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt anyone else. The man released him with a shove. You'd better mean that, kid. The two men turned and walked back toward the gate, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. David and I ducked lower, holding our breath as they passed by, their shadows stretching long across the yard. Once they were gone, we waited a few agonizing seconds before stepping out from the bushes. Brad! I called softly, rushing toward him. He spun around, his face pale and drenched with sweat. What are you doing here? He hissed. Trying to help you. I shot back. Who were those guys? What the hell is going on? Brad ran a shaky hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the yard. You shouldn't have come. They'll see you as a threat now. A threat to what? David demanded. Brad hesitated, then sighed. They work for one of my dad's old business partners. The guy's been trying to keep everything under wraps, but he thinks I'm going to blow the whole thing wide open. Are you? I asked. Brad looked at me, his expression torn. I don't know, he admitted. I wanted to expose all of them, but now, I don't think I can. Not without putting everyone I care about in danger. You don't have to do this alone, I said. We can go to the police. We have the documents from the courthouse. Brad cut me off with a bitter laugh. The police? You really think they'll take down guys like this? They own half the town. Before I could argue, the roar of an engine shattered the quiet. We turned to see the black SUV from earlier speeding down the street, its headlights slicing through the darkness. They're back, Brad whispered, his voice trembling. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm. We need to go. Now. Part 10, The Chase. The roar of the black SUV's engine grew louder as it sped toward Brad's house. My heart was hammering in my chest as I grabbed Brad's arm and yanked him toward the side gate. Move! I shouted, pulling him along. David was right behind us, glancing over his shoulder at the looming headlights. We sprinted through the backyard, the sound of gravel crunching beneath our feet mixing with the adrenaline-fueled thud of my heartbeat. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to get away. As we cut through the neighbor's yard, the SUV screeched to a halt in front of Brad's house. Doors slammed, and I could hear voices barking orders. They saw us, David hissed. This way, Brad said, veering toward a narrow alley that ran between two houses. The alley was dark, the faint glow of streetlights barely reaching the cracked pavement beneath our feet. We ducked low, trying to stay out of sight as the voices grew louder behind us. They can't be far, one of the men shouted. I glanced at Brad, who looked like he was about to collapse. His face was pale, and his breathing was ragged. We can't outrun them, I said, my own lungs burning. We need to hide. Brad nodded, scanning the alley. There, he said, pointing to a dumpster tucked behind a row of trash bins. We crouched behind it, huddling close as we tried to catch our breath. The footsteps and voices were getting closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. This is insane, David whispered. What are we supposed to do if they find us? Stay quiet, Brad muttered, his voice barely audible. And pray they don't. The men's shadows stretched across the pavement as they entered the alley. My stomach clenched as I heard one of them speak. They came this way. Check every corner. The sound of trash bins being overturned filled the air, each metallic crash making me flinch. I pressed myself tighter against the dumpster, willing myself to disappear. Then a miracle, the distant wail of police sirens. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Let's go, one of them barked. We'll deal with this later. Their footsteps retreated, and I exhaled a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. We stayed hidden until the sirens faded, just to be sure. When we finally emerged, Brad was shaking so hard he could barely stand. This isn't over, he said, his voice raw. They'll come after me again. And now they know about you too. Then we need to end this, I said firmly. We have the documents. We can take them to someone higher up, the state police, the FBI, someone who can actually do something. Brad hesitated, his eyes filled with fear and doubt. You're not alone in this, I added. We can't let them win. Brad looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, let's do it. The events of that night were just the beginning of a fight that would test us all. But it was also the start of something bigger, a reckoning for the people who thought they were untouchable. Summary: the reckoning and redemption. After that terrifying night, Brad, David, and I worked together to expose the truth. The documents we found at the courthouse were enough to convince a sympathetic detective from the state police to open an investigation. Brad also shared the full story of his father's crimes, detailing the exploitation and abuse his dad and his business partners had orchestrated for years. It wasn't easy. The men Brad feared were powerful and well-connected, and they tried everything to silence us. Threatening letters, shadowy figures following us, and even a break-in at David's house made it clear they wouldn't go down without a fight. But we refused to back down. With the help of the state police, Brad agreed to testify. His confession letter became a key piece of evidence, and eventually, the entire network of corruption unraveled. Brad's father and his associates were arrested, and their crimes made headlines across the state. For Brad, the fallout was devastating but freeing. His family's wealth was gone, and his relationship with his parents was shattered. But for the first time, he could breathe without the crushing weight of secrets and guilt. Our lives changed too. I was no longer Mouse. The kid who once felt powerless had helped bring down a powerful group of criminals. David and I became closer than ever, bonded by the chaos we'd endured. As for Brad, he was a different person by the end of it all. He apologized, truly apologized for everything he'd done to me over the years. It wasn't an easy friendship to rebuild, but I saw the sincerity in his eyes. The last I heard, Brad left town and started over in a new city. He got a job with a nonprofit that helps at-risk youth, channeling his pain into something good. Life has a way of punishing those who do wrong, but it also gives people the chance to change. Brad's bullies, including himself, were brought low, but he rose again, this time as someone better. And me? I finally found my voice. I'm not the scared kid hiding in the shadows anymore. Life gave me the strength to fight back, and I'll carry that strength with me forever.